A millionaire finds an unconscious woman by the lake near his home and decides to help her. 2 days later, he is shocked to see who shows up at his door. The quietness of Lakeview, Wisconsin, on that early spring Saturday was interrupted only by the rhythmic lapping of water against the rocks and the distant call of loons gliding over Silverstone Lake. Richard Coleman, 52 years old, millionaire and reclusive, walked along the private shoreline of his estate with the calm deliberation of a man who had nowhere else to be. His steps were steady, hands sunk deep in the pockets of his wool coat, his eyes scanning the calm lake like he always did, not in search of anything, but in resignation. For 7 years now, these walks had been a ritual, a silent negotiation between him and his grief. Once he would have walked this path hand in hand with Madeline. Her laugh used to echo off the trees, her energy a sharp contrast to his measured nature. But since she passed, Lakeview had become a place of seclusion. The townspeople rarely saw him. The staff knew to keep their distance unless called. Richard had designed his world that way, predictable, private, numb. The morning air still held the bite of winter, though the sunlight promised warmth. As he reached a familiar bend by the water, something unusual caught his eye. A form, awkward and unnatural, partially hidden among the stones at the edge of the lake. For a moment he thought it might be driftwood or some animal washed ashore, but as he stepped closer, a chill not from the cold crept up his spine. It was a woman. She lay half-curled, her body awkwardly slumped against the uneven ground. One arm extended as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her clothes were soaked and muddy, clinging to her like they'd been through a storm. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He knelt beside her carefully, afraid to move her, unsure if she was breathing. His hand hovered, then pressed gently to her neck. A pulse, faint, but there. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her face was pale, framed by tangled, wet hair streaked with dirt and blood. A cut on her forehead had dried into a dark line above her brow. Her lips were cracked, her fingers cold and trembling even in unconsciousness. He looked around. There was no one in sight. The lake was still, the trees whispered with the breeze, and the path leading to town was empty. "Jesus," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His instincts warred between calling for help and acting immediately. But something about the isolation of the moment, or perhaps the vulnerability of the figure before him, made him move. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her carefully. Then, lifting her with a strength he hadn't used in years, he began the walk back to the house, her weight awkward but not heavy. She was smaller than he had first thought. Inside, he placed her gently on the couch in the main living room, near the fireplace, and called Dr. Malcolm Hensley, his longtime private physician, the only person who would come without asking too many questions. "She's unconscious, possibly injured. I need you here as soon as you can," Richard said, his voice clipped. "Is she family?" Malcolm asked, a pause in his voice. "No. I found her by the lake. Just get here." Malcolm arrived 20 minutes later, his black SUV kicking up gravel as it rolled into the driveway. While Richard paced silently nearby, Malcolm examined the woman, cleaned the wound, checked her vitals, and finally injected a mild sedative to keep her from waking too quickly and panicked. "She's dehydrated, exhausted, some bruising, but nothing broken, the cut superficial. She'll wake up soon, but I'd keep her warm and resting." "No ID?" Malcolm asked, glancing at Richard. "Nothing. No bag, no wallet, no phone. Just like that." "You want me to report this?" Richard paused. "Not yet." Malcolm didn't push. He left after giving instructions and leaving a medical kit behind. Richard watched him go before turning back to the woman, now wrapped in blankets on the guest bed upstairs. Her breathing had steadied, her color returning slightly. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Who was she? What had happened? He tried to imagine scenarios: an accident, a runaway, someone attacked and dumped near the water. None of them made sense in the quiet, affluent Lakeview. He stayed up most of the night, checking on her, unable to sleep. It was only near dawn when his body gave in. He fell asleep in a chair in the hallway outside her room, a habit long forgotten, awakened by the smallest sound, a memory from long ago of nights beside Madeline's hospital bed. When he woke again, the sun was shining through the window. Inside the room she stirred. Richard stood slowly and walked in, careful not to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, hazel, confused. She blinked at the ceiling, then at him. Her mouth opened, lips dry. "You're safe," Richard said calmly. "You're at my home. I found you by the lake. Do you remember anything?" She frowned, tried to sit up, then winced. "Easy," he said, stepping closer. I don't..." Her voice cracked. "Where am I?" "Lakeview. My name is Richard Coleman. You're in my guest room. You were unconscious when I found you yesterday." She looked around as if trying to place herself. Her expression turned from confusion to fear, but she said nothing more. "Do you know your name?" She hesitated. "No, I don't think I do." Richard watched her closely. There was something in her eyes, not just fear, but a flicker of recognition. He didn't know from where or why, but as he stepped back, giving her space, a strange unease settled in him, because even though she claimed to remember nothing, even though her name was a blank, something about her seemed familiar. He stared at her, trying to place the feeling. The angles of her face, the curve of her mouth, even the way she'd looked at him when she first opened her eyes. It all stirred something inside him. As she drifted back into sleep, still weak, he stood in the doorway, silent. Who is she? And how did she end up here? The questions echoed in his mind as the sun rose higher over Silverstone Lake. Richard sat in the chair by the window, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the woman who still lay unconscious in the guest bed. The fire in the nearby hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the dark wood floors and beige walls of the room. Outside, the early morning haze lifted slowly off Silverstone Lake, yet inside the house the atmosphere remained dense, heavy with unspoken questions. She had stirred during the night, murmured incoherently, then fallen back into a deep sleep. Now, with the daylight filtering through linen curtains, she lay motionless again, her brow relaxed as if whatever dreams she wandered through were kinder than reality. Her name, still a mystery. Her past, a blank void. But there was something about her presence, even in stillness, that disrupted the practiced calm of Richard's solitude. He stood up slowly, joints cracking slightly from the long hours of sitting still. He walked over to the side of the bed and studied her face again. Without the blood and dirt, her features appeared more defined, elegant, almost delicate, but not unfamiliar. Richard couldn't say where or when he might have seen her before, but his unease grew with every glance. The doctor's words from the previous day echoed in his mind. Exhaustion, dehydration, a superficial head wound. None of it explained why she was alone by the lake, nor why she had no identification, no phone, not even shoes. The only thing she had when he found her was a torn strip of what looked like lining from a coat's interior pocket, clutched tightly in her hand. He had placed it on the nightstand, dark fabric, frayed edges, completely unremarkable. And yet she had held onto it like it meant something. Later that morning, when she finally opened her eyes again, Richard was there, offering her water in a glass he held with both hands. She accepted it wordlessly, drank slowly and let out a long breath when she finished. "Do you remember anything?" he asked softly, kneeling to her level. "Your name, where you came from. What happened?" She hesitated, her eyes darting, around the room scanning everything as if seeing it for the first time. I don't know," she said. Her voice was hoarse but clearer now. "There's nothing, just pieces." "Pieces," Richard prompted, his voice calm. "Flashes, a car, headlights, someone shouting, then cold, then nothing." She closed her eyes again, her hand clutching the blanket as if grounding herself in the present. Richard watched her carefully. It wasn't just confusion in her expression, it was frustration, the kind that came from knowing something was wrong and being unable to reach whatever truth lay buried just beyond the edge of her memory. "Well," he said finally, Until you remember more, you'll need a name, something to go by. She opened her eyes, looking at him directly for the first time. Eleanor, she said, the name slipping out almost involuntarily. Is that your name? I don't know, she said, but it feels right. For now. Eleanor, then, Richard agreed. Over the next few hours, he helped her move to a sitting position, brought her soft food, and kept conversation light. She asked only a few questions about where she was and how he had found her. When he mentioned she was in Wisconsin, her expression didn't change. No spark of familiarity, just more blank spaces. He didn't press. He had learned over years of dealing with grief that pressure only hardened the walls the mind built to protect itself. If she was going to remember, it would come in time. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. Later that day, after ensuring she was resting again, Richard went to his office, a quiet, book-lined room overlooking the water. He sat at his desk, turned on his laptop, and began searching. Missing persons databases, local news archives, forums about unsolved cases. He typed in various combinations of keywords: woman found lake, missing woman Wisconsin, unidentified female injured, lost memory trauma. The results were overwhelming, most irrelevant, but after hours of combing through poorly formatted pages and dead links, something caught his attention. On a local community forum, buried deep within a thread about strange events in rural counties, was a photo posted 3 years earlier. It showed a young woman smiling at a town fair. The resolution was poor, the lighting uneven, but something about the eyes, the shape of the face, struck him immediately. He clicked on the image, enlarged it. The caption beneath read, Eleanor. Blake disappeared after this photo was taken. Case closed, presumed dead. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Eleanor. Elena. The resemblance was undeniable. Could it be her? He printed the photo and brought it upstairs. Unsure why, unsure what he hoped to prove. Elena was asleep again. He placed the photo on the nightstand next to the torn piece of fabric. For a moment he just stood there, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt fragile, as if it could be shattered at any moment. There was a story behind this woman, one that stretched further than a walk by the lake, and Richard, despite himself, was being drawn into it. That night, he dreamed of Madeline for the first time in months. Not the sick, fragile version of her that had haunted his sleep before, but the lively, bright-eyed woman he had fallen in love with. She was walking beside him along the lake. When she looked up at him, her expression was one of calm but deep concern. "Don't turn away this time," she said. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, unsure what the dream meant, but unable to shake the sense of warning it carried. When he went upstairs, Eleanor was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo he had left there. "Is this me?" she asked. "I think so," he said carefully. "Do you remember anything about it?" "No," she said, "but it feels familiar, like a place I used to be, like a face I once wore." Richard said nothing. The pieces were coming together, but they weren't forming a picture yet. She held up the photo, tilting it toward the morning light. "Eleanor," she whispered, and Richard, hearing that name spoken aloud for the first time, felt the air shift around them. Something had just changed. Something irreversible. For the following 2 days, the Coleman estate became a strange sanctuary, cloaked in a tense quiet that neither Richard nor Elena dared to break with anything more than what was necessary. She moved carefully through the house, wrapped in one of the oversized sweaters Richard had found in a storage trunk upstairs, her steps tentative, as though each room held a thread of memory waiting to pull her into a past she still couldn't reach. The name Eleanor lingered between them, unspoken during most conversations, but it hovered in the air like a storm cloud, always on the verge of releasing. Richard kept his routine of silent observation. Mornings were spent by the lake, eyes scanning the water, as if it could tell him more than what Elena herself could. Evenings passed with half-finished meals and brief exchanges, always polite, always veiled with caution. But he couldn't help noticing the patterns emerging. The way she touched the spines of books as she passed the shelves in the library, pausing longer at legal thrillers. How she reacted to certain smells from the kitchen, cinnamon, rosemary, peppermint, as though they teased something loose in her mind. And at night, the sounds, murmurs, restless shifting, cries that woke her up panting and shaken. On the third morning, Richard found her standing barefoot in the hallway outside the master bedroom, staring at a painting. It was a portrait of Madeline, taken a few years before her illness. Elegant, poised, her eyes locked with the viewers in a way that had always made Richard feel both comforted and seen. Elena's hand was trembling as she reached toward the frame. "Do you know her?" Richard asked quietly. She flinched but didn't turn around. "No, I don't think so. She was my wife." "She looks kind," Elena said, voice thin. She was. Very kind, very brave. Elena lowered her hand, but her eyes remained on the portrait. "There's something about her face," she murmured. "Not that I remember her, just something." They stood in silence, and Richard could feel the weight of unsaid things building. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were glassy, and he realized she had been holding back tears. "I had a dream last night," she said. "There was a man shouting. I couldn't see his face. We were in a car driving fast, then lights, a sharp turn, screaming, then nothing, just darkness." Richard guided her to the living room, where she sat curled on the couch, knees drawn. Close, arms wrapped tightly around herself. He poured her tea, not asking more questions immediately. She needed space. But he also knew time wasn't their ally. The longer they waited, the deeper whatever truths hid behind her fractured mind would bury themselves. Later that day, while Elena rested, Richard returned to his search. He created a private email to contact local online communities and forums, asking about the case of Eleanor Blake. Using a pseudonym, he posted a message in a thread about long-cold disappearances, attaching the same photo that had sparked his suspicions. "Has anyone seen this woman? I believe she may be alive," seeking information about her past or where she was last seen. The replies came slowly at first. Some were dismissive, others wild with conspiracy, but one caught his eye. A user named Truthseeker19 replied with a link to an archived article from a local Harper Ridge newspaper, dated 3 years prior. It detailed the sudden disappearance of Eleanor Blake, 27 years old, a data analyst who had recently filed complaints against a tech startup she worked for, alleging financial fraud and misuse of personal data. According to the article, she had gone missing less than 2 weeks after filing a confidential report with internal auditors. Police had found her car abandoned near a remote trailhead. No signs of struggle, no confirmed sightings after that. Her apartment had been left untouched. Friends reported she'd become paranoid in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, afraid she was being followed. The case was quietly shelved 6 months later due to lack of evidence. Richard stared at the screen, the pieces slowly aligning. When Eleanor came downstairs that evening, he handed her the printed article without saying a word. She read it twice, then again, her fingers tightening on the edges of the page. "This says I'm dead," she whispered. "No," Richard corrected, gently. "It says you disappeared, that you were presumed dead. I think I remember filing something, a complaint." Her eyes widened. There was a man, not the one from the dream, someone else, friendly or pretending to be. He told me they'd handle it quietly. He said I was doing the right thing. "Do you remember the name of the company?" She shook her head. "But I remember the logo. It was green, shaped like a prism. 3 sides. Richard jotted it down. The description wasn't much, but it was something. Enough to start a search. That night, after Elena had gone to bed, Richard contacted Karen Whitmore, an old friend, and semi-retired lawyer who had once worked corporate cases in Chicago. He trusted her. More than that, she was thorough, discreet, and would not question his motives if he told her someone's life was at stake. When she answered, her tone was sleepy but sharp. "Coleman, it's been years. You better not be in jail. I need your help, quietly, off the record." Karen paused. "This doesn't sound like the man who vanished from society 7 years ago." "It's important." He explained briefly what had happened, carefully choosing his words. "He didn't mention names yet. only that he believed a missing person had reappeared under strange circumstances, and that her disappearance might have been linked to internal whistleblowing at a tech company in Wisconsin. "You're going to owe me dinner and a very good bottle of wine for this," she said. "Send me everything you have. Photo, name, dates, keywords. I'll get back to you." When he hung up, Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He felt the gears shifting around him, slowly grinding into motion. The woman asleep upstairs was not just a lost soul who had stumbled into his life. She was a key, maybe even a threat, to something much larger. He rose, went to check on her one more time. She slept curled against the window, the article about Eleanor still clutched in her hand. The past was beginning to bleed through the cracks, and whatever truths it carried, they were no longer content to stay buried. Karen returned the call less than 24 hours later. Richard was in the greenhouse, pruning one of Madeline's old camellia bushes, when his phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He answered without hesitation. "I found something," she said, her voice sharpened by adrenaline and curiosity. "It's not just a theory anymore. Eleanor Blake is real, and she's not just a name on a file. She filed a whistleblower complaint in October of 2019 against a private tech security firm based out of Milwaukee. The company was called Etherbridge Systems, small, highly specialized, known for contracting with law enforcement and political campaigns." Richard stepped out of the greenhouse, letting the door swing shut behind him. The cold air hit his face as he walked toward the main house. "They handled sensitive data," Karen continued. "Eleanor worked in encryption analysis. She reported a series of internal anomalies, data packets rerouted through offshore servers, missing logs, unexplained fund transfers. The kind of red flags that could bury a company if exposed. 2 weeks later, she vanished. Case was marked unresolved. No suspects. No clear evidence of foul play." "She's here," Richard said. "She doesn't remember much, but she's starting to piece things together. She called herself Elena at first, but when she saw her picture, she knew. She just knew." There was silence on the line, then a low whistle from Karen. "That explains the trail of cover-ups. You do realize this is bigger than just a missing persons case now?" "I'm beginning to," Richard said. "And if someone went through the trouble of erasing her, they'll want to know where she is now." Richard's jaw tightened. "I won't let them find her." That evening, when he returned inside, he found Elena in the library, sitting on the floor with a pile of books around her, many unopened, some scattered as if she had been looking for something and grown frustrated. She didn't notice him at first, not until he stepped closer. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up, her expression tight with concentration. "There's this feeling, like something's pressing against the edge of my brain. I was reading this book about corporate fraud, and suddenly I had this image. In my mind, rows of screens, security feeds, numbers rolling across a dashboard. It felt real, like I've seen it before, like I worked in that environment." Richard sat beside her. "You did. You were a data analyst for a tech security firm. You filed a report, then you disappeared." She stared at him. "Do you know the name of the company?" "Etherbridge Systems, Milwaukee." Her breath caught in her throat. She repeated the name under her breath, testing it. "Etherbridge. That? Yes. That's it. I remember the logo. I remember the layout of the office. It was cold. Grey. Carpets, glass walls, they monitored everything, even our screens. You weren't wrong to be afraid. I had a friend there," she said, her voice trembling. "I think he tried to help me. Or maybe he warned me not to do it. I can't remember. But I know I didn't disappear by choice. Someone made sure I vanished." Richard didn't speak for a while. He let her memory settle, let her draw comfort from the firelight and the presence of someone who didn't need her to explain everything right away. When she finally looked up at him again, her eyes were clearer, steadier. "I want to remember everything," she said, "even if it hurts. You will, one piece at a time." The next day, while Eleanor slept, Karen sent over a file. Richard printed everything. Company reports, internal memos leaked anonymously to forums, public records of lawsuits settled quietly. Eleanor's name appeared on one HR memo, filed weeks before her disappearance, where she had been transferred to a different department with no explanation. Another document showed her resignation letter, never verified, typed without signature, submitted 2 days before her car was found abandoned. Suspicious, too clean, too convenient. That afternoon, Elena found the documents on Richard's desk and began to read through them. As she did, her hands trembled, her breathing grew shallow. She sat down abruptly and stared at one particular name near the bottom of a legal document. Jonathan Faulkner, Director of Security at Etherbridge. "I know him," she said. "He was the one who told me it wasn't safe to go to the press. He acted like he was helping. He brought me coffee once a week. He said I reminded him of his sister." "Do you think he betrayed you?" "I don't. No, I remember trusting him. Maybe too much." That evening, Richard found her sitting at the piano in the main room, fingers pressing the keys without force, as though touching something familiar she didn't yet dare to play. The melody she tapped out was broken and slow, but carried something melancholy that stuck in his chest. "Did you play before?" he asked. "I think so. It's like muscle memory. I don't know the songs, but my fingers do." He watched her, resisting the urge to draw closer. There was a fragility to her strength, a tension that had settled deep in her bones. But there was also a quiet fire, growing behind her eyes now, a resolve that hadn't been there when she first woke in his guest bed. "You said your wife used to play," she murmured, eyes still on the keys. "Yes, every evening, until she couldn't anymore." "She must have loved it here." "She did. She made this place feel alive." Elena nodded. "It feels safe here, like I can start over, but I know I can't hide forever." Richard leaned against the doorway. "When you're ready, we'll figure out what comes next." That night, Elena had another dream. She woke screaming, drenched in sweat, her voice cracked from crying out. Richard was at her side in seconds. She clung to his arm, eyes wild, until she realized where she was. "I saw a file," she gasped. "It had my name on it and others, so many names, and there was a symbol, like an eagle but twisted, red and black. I think it was part of something bigger. Government contracts, maybe. The data wasn't just being stolen, it was being sold." Richard sat with her until her breathing calmed, until her eyes closed again, exhausted. But her words remained with him through the night. He returned to his office, brought up the printed reports again, and found the name that matched the symbol she described. One of Etherbridge's silent partners had been a private intelligence consulting firm known for shady lobbying ties and black-budget projects. The rabbit hole went deeper than he had imagined. The next morning, while Elena took her tea on the back patio, Richard stepped into his study and dialed Karen once again. "I think this goes beyond corporate fraud," he said. "I think Eleanor uncovered something they'd killed to keep buried." "And now she's back," Karen replied, "which means it's only a matter of time before they find out." Richard turned to the window, watching Elena's silhouette against the lake. The wind stirred her hair, and she stood there motionless as if waiting for a signal only she could feel. "They'll come looking for her," he said, "but I won't let them take her again." The following morning, Richard found himself staring at a satellite map on his computer screen. His eyes scanned the stretch of rural terrain just outside, Harper Ridge, where Etherbridge Systems had once operated a temporary data facility. According to the archived permits Karen had managed to retrieve, the building had been leased for only 18 months, and its official purpose had been labeled as secure archival processing. But what Elena had described in her fragmented memories suggested something far more complex and far more dangerous. The mention of government contracts, black market data exchanges, and that twisted eagle symbol all pointed to operations that skirted legality. Eleanor stood silently behind him, watching as he zoomed in on the coordinates. She recognized the curvature of the road, the long rectangular shadow cast by the facility's structure. "I've been there," she said quietly. "I know I have. The lights were always too bright inside, no windows. They kept it cold even in summer. There were cameras in every hallway." "You worked there?" "Not officially. I think I was reassigned there for a project. That's what they called it. Jonathan Faulkner brought me in. He said it was a chance to prove myself, but it wasn't about promotion, it was isolation." Richard clicked on an adjacent parcel. of land and opened up another file. Karen found someone. The former head of operations during that period retired early, bought a piece of land outside town. No phone listed, but she tracked his property tax records. Name's Daniel Crane. Eleanor stared at the name. A flicker passed over her features. Recognition, maybe, or fear. That name, I remember hearing it in meetings. He wasn't just a supervisor. He approved everything. Budgets, protocols, clearances. If something happened to me, he would have known. Richard looked at her. Do you want to go there? Elena didn't answer right away. She stood at the window watching the branches sway in the wind. Yes, she said finally. I need to see him. I need to know if he remembers me. They left early the next morning, using Richard's black SUV. The ride to Harper Ridge took nearly 4 hours, winding through tree-lined roads and past small towns that hadn't changed in decades. Eleanor sat quietly for most of the trip, staring out the window, occasionally closing her eyes as if trying to summon something buried deep. Richard respected her silence, offering only a steady presence. They arrived just before noon. Crane's. Property was modest, an old farmhouse with peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and a long dirt driveway flanked by overgrown grass. A wind chime clinked gently as they approached. Richard parked and looked at Elena. You sure? She nodded. I'm ready. He knocked. A long moment passed before the door opened. Daniel Crane looked older than expected, balding, slightly stooped, but with sharp eyes that flicked from Richard to Elena instantly. You're not selling anything, are you? No, Richard said calmly. We just want to talk. Crane studied them. His gaze lingered on Elena. Something changed in his posture. I know that face, he murmured. We think you do, Richard said. May we come in? Crane hesitated, then opened the door wider. 5 minutes. That's all? The inside of the house was dim and cluttered, filled with outdated electronics, books stacked in corners, papers in unruly piles. He led them to a den that looked like it hadn't been dusted in years. Elena sat across from him, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Crane didn't offer coffee or pleasantries. You're Eleanor Blake, he said flatly. Yes, she replied. I thought you were dead. I was supposed to be. Crane rubbed his face. I warned Faulkner not to push it. You were too close to the center. You saw too much. What did I see? She asked. I remember data, names, a system, routing information outside the firewall, government seals, encrypted paths, but not the whole picture. Crane shook his head. You were tracing access logs that never should have existed, not just breaches, structured channels designed to funnel data from voter records, law enforcement, feeds, even military assessments, into private servers. The company was laundering intelligence. Someone upstairs had deals with firms in DC, some of them not even real companies. And what happened to me? Elena's voice was steady now, colder. Why did I vanish? You were set up. The resignation letter, forged. The HR transfer, orchestrated. Faulkner told me they'd handle it when I raised concerns. Next thing I knew, your car was found empty, and no one was allowed to speak your name again. You said nothing, Richard asked. I quit 4 months later. I didn't want to end up like her. Crane stood and crossed to a locked cabinet. He opened it with a key from his pocket and pulled out a dusty metal box. Inside, he removed a small flash drive and placed it on the table. I kept this. Not everything, but enough. I never knew what to do with it. I thought if I went public, they'd bury me, but if you're back, maybe it's time. Eleanor took the drive, fingers trembling slightly. What's on it? Internal emails, shadow contracts, code signatures. The file you were building, your report, was erased from every server, but I managed to reconstruct fragments from backups. You were right about everything. Richard asked the only question that mattered then. Can this expose them? Crane nodded slowly. If you survive long enough to deliver it. They left soon after. Eleanor sat in silence again during the drive back, but this time her expression wasn't blank. It was filled with intent. We need to make copies, she said. Keep it safe. We will, Richard replied. Just as they were nearing the highway turnoff back to Lakeview, Richard noticed a vehicle behind them, dark SUV, windows tinted, following too closely. He changed lanes. The SUV followed. He exited early, took a rural detour, still behind them. Elena noticed. "We're being followed." "I see it." Richard didn't panic. He drove calmly, turning down a gravel road that led to an abandoned logging trail. They drove in silence for 5 minutes, until the SUV finally passed the turn and kept going. "Could have been coincidence," he muttered. "Or not," Eleanor said. "They know someone went to see Crane. They'll come for him too." Back at the house that night, Richard encrypted the drive and made multiple copies, storing one in his safe and another inside a locked drawer in Karen's office. Eleanor barely slept, her mind whirring as pieces clicked together. She began scribbling notes, drawing diagrams, even sketching faces she remembered, one of them clearly Jonathan Faulkner, another still a blur. For the first time since waking, up on the edge of Silverstone Lake, she wasn't lost. She was hunting, but now that they had the files, they weren't the only ones paying attention. The air in Lakeview was thick with tension the morning the man arrived. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull grey that flattened shadows and made the trees look lifeless. Richard had spent most of the early hours pacing the halls, unable to focus, checking the security cameras he had installed years ago, but never truly needed until now. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, half stirring her tea, her eyes distant. Since returning from Harper Ridge, she hadn't spoken much, but her focus had changed. She was sharper now, more deliberate, like a compass finally pointing north. They had barely finished eating when the front gate's motion sensor chimed. Richard reached for the tablet that controlled the surveillance feed. A black sedan was idling just outside the property line, too clean, too deliberate in its presence. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a dark coat, carrying a slim black briefcase. He looked around, adjusted his cuffs, and walked calmly up to the intercom panel at the gate. "He doesn't look like someone lost," Eleanor said, already on her feet. Richard pressed the intercom button before the man could reach for it. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his voice steady. The man looked directly into the camera. "Mr. Coleman, my name is Owen Kessler. I represent private interests formally, associated with Etherbridge Systems. I'm not here to cause trouble. I simply have some paperwork that needs clarification. I believe one of your guests might be able to assist." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kessler smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. May I leave a card?" "You may leave the property." There was a pause. Then, with eerie calm, Kessler reached into his coat, pulled out a small black card and placed it into the gate's letterbox. Without another word, he returned to his car and drove off. Richard watched until the vehicle disappeared down the road, then retrieved the card. It bore only a name, Kessler Owen, and a phone number. No company logo, no title. Elena, watching from the porch, had turned pale. "I know that name," she said, almost in a whisper. "He worked for them." "Not officially. He was listed as a consultant, but we all knew he handled the things that didn't go through HR. I only saw him once, but I remember his voice. He ran the exit interviews." Richard didn't ask what that meant. He had a feeling it wasn't a standard corporate procedure. "He knows I'm here," she added. "He came to see me, not you." "He's testing the waters," Richard said, "seeing if we'll panic." "Well, it's working," she muttered, turning and walking back into the house. Richard didn't call the number. He filed the card away and increased the security settings around the estate. All entry points were reinforced, cameras synced, with remote backups, alerts routed to his private phone. He considered calling the police, but knew what he'd say would raise more questions than answers. Elena's presence couldn't be explained without unraveling everything. That night, Elena didn't sleep. She spent hours in the library, cross-referencing old files with the contents of Crane's flash drive. Richard sat nearby, pretending to read, but watching her. Around midnight, she finally looked up. There was a pattern in the data transfers. They weren't random. Each week, the outgoing logs synced with public announcements from major political figures, policy shifts, corporate mergers, insider trades. Etherbridge wasn't just stealing information, they were shaping events. "You think they were feeding data to influence decisions?" "More than that," she said. They were selling leverage. Imagine a company that knows which senator is hiding offshore accounts or which tech CEO is negotiating in secret with foreign investors. They didn't just collect data, they used it to control outcomes. Richard absorbed the implications in silence. The power to predict and manipulate was worth billions, and people had tried to kill to keep it hidden. The following day, Richard received a call from Karen. "I ran a trace on Kessler. He's not just a consultant. He's on record as having worked in multiple strategy roles for front companies that folded within months. All of them tied to private defense contracts. He's a ghost, Richard, the kind that doesn't leave fingerprints." Richard relayed everything to Eleanor. She sat quietly, listening, her face unreadable. "He won't stop," she said finally. "Not until he's sure I'm gone for good. He thinks you're scared." "I am," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean I'll run." Later that afternoon, Elena went for a walk along the edge of the lake. Richard watched from the porch, tension coiling in his chest. She had started walking farther each day, as if reclaiming territory that had once been part of her captivity. He understood that instinct. Years ago, after Madeline's funeral, he'd done the same, mapping out the world in small, manageable steps until the grief no longer swallowed the sky. When she returned, he saw something new in her eyes, not fear, not anger, certainty. "If they're watching us, we watch them too," she said. "We don't hide, we prepare." That night, she showed him a drawing she had made from memory, a floor plan of the Harper Ridge facility, complete with server room locations, access doors, and camera angles. The detail was astonishing. Richard realized she had spent the last few days not just remembering, she had been reconstructing. "They'll want this," she said. "It proves I was there. If we match it with Crane's data, it's not just a theory anymore." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we take the next step." Elena looked out the window toward the lake where she had nearly died. "They thought they erased me," she said, "but they didn't understand one thing." "What's that?" "I was never just a number in their system. I was the one who built it." The morning after the visit from Owen Kessler, the atmosphere in the house was no longer one of cautious recovery. It had shifted, palpably, into preparation. The man's appearance had confirmed what Richard had feared and what Elena had instinctively known. Time was no longer on their side. The organization that had orchestrated her disappearance had begun to close in again. The past was not just catching up, it was coming through the front door. Richard stood by the breakfast counter, phone pressed to his ear, listening as Karen outlined possible legal strategies. Her voice, calm but urgent, underscored the gravity of the moment. "If you take this to the authorities directly, there's a real chance it will be buried before it sees the light of day. You're dealing with people who know exactly how to choke a story at the root. You need outside pressure, visibility." Richard watched Elena across the room. She was assembling papers into folders, scanning and encrypting files from Crane's flash drive, building a digital trail so intricate it would take a government-level intervention to erase it all. She was preparing not just for confrontation, but for war. "Can you get us access to anyone in the press who won't flinch?" he asked. Karen paused. "There's a journalist in Chicago, independent, aggressive. Name's Tessa Holloway. She runs a small investigative outlet. If this breaks anywhere, it'll be with her. Connect us." After the call, Richard approached Elena. "We're going to Chicago. There's someone who might help. Someone who's not afraid to publish what you've uncovered." Elena looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Before that, I need to do something." "Where?" "Harper Ridge. One more time." Richard hesitated. "It's not safe." "I know," she said, "but I have to see someone. The man who warned me once, before everything went dark. He might know more than Crane did. He was trying to protect me. If he's still there, I owe him the truth." They drove out that afternoon, Eleanor guiding with half-remembered directions and instinct. The town had barely changed, still quiet, still suspended in the same rhythm of forgotten industry and cold winters. Eleanor directed them to a modest brick apartment complex near the edge of town. The mailbox read, L. Fordham. Eleanor knocked, nerves tight, shoulders squared. The door opened after a long pause, revealing a man in his 30s, unshaven, eyes wary. He stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "Elena." "You remember me," she said, her voice catching. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "I was supposed to be. Can we come in?" Inside, the apartment was sparsely furnished, clean but minimal. Fordham sat across from them, his hands trembling slightly. "I tried to warn you," he said. "I sent that message, but they pulled me off the project the next day. I didn't know what happened. I figured they'd done what they do." "They tried," Elena said, "but I survived." Richard watched the exchange quietly. Fordham looked at Elena with a mixture of guilt and awe. "I kept something," Fordham said suddenly. "I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping you'd come back." He stood, crossed to a locked cabinet, and retrieved a small stack of folders. Inside were copies of internal memos, meeting minutes, and a list of names. Elena scanned them quickly. "These are employee clearance levels," she said. "There's a tier I didn't know existed." "The black level," Fordham said. Only 3 people had access: Crane, Faulkner, and someone from DC, a man named Mason Doyle. He wasn't on payroll, but he showed up twice during closed briefings. When you started asking questions, Doyle was the one who ordered the files. Scrubbed. "Do you have anything connecting Doyle to the asset pipeline?" "Just a signature," Fordham replied, "but it matches the one on your transfer." That was the final proof they needed. Confirmation that the decision to erase her hadn't been internal alone. It had been ordered from the outside, sanctioned by someone with power beyond the company. As they left the apartment, Eleanor was quiet. Back in the car, she stared at the folder in her lap. "They took everything," she said softly, "but they forgot one thing." "What's that?" Richard asked. "I was the one who wrote the algorithm. I know how they built their pipeline because I designed the first iteration of it. They modified it, weaponized it, but the architecture was mine. That means I can trace it." That night, they stayed in a small inn on the outskirts of town, off the main road. Richard couldn't sleep. He paced the room while Eleanor sat at the desk, assembling the data into a coherent structure. A trail from Etherbridge to its silent partners, to the intelligence firm, and finally to the name at the top, Mason Doyle. They left for Chicago the next morning under a low gray sky. The city's skyline loomed in the distance by midday, sharp against the clouds. They parked in a private lot and took a rideshare to a nondescript building in an industrial district. The offices of the Holloway Report were nothing more than a converted loft with reinforced windows and stacks of equipment humming along the walls. Tessa Holloway met them at the door. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with a demeanor that said she'd seen more than most editors in national newsrooms. "Karen warned me you were coming," she said, waving them inside. "Said you had something that could ruin lives. I've heard that before." Eleanor pulled out the drive. "This one actually will." Holloway listened for 3 hours as they laid it all out. She took notes, recorded audio, verified documents in real time. Her expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment to quiet fury. "This is going to cause a storm," she said. "Finally. You're going to be targeted." "We already are," Richard said. Holloway turned to Elena. "If we run this, you'll need protection, relocation, maybe even a new identity." "I've had enough of hiding," Elena said. "I want the world to see what they did." That night, they returned to Lakeview, exhausted but with purpose. Eleanor slept soundly for the first time in weeks. In the morning, Richard found her standing at the edge of the lake, wind lifting her hair. "I thought I came here to disappear," she said, "but maybe I came here to remember who I was." Richard stepped beside her. "No," he said. "You came here to finish what you started." The silence of the morning in Lakeview was fractured by a slow shift in atmosphere. It was no longer the quiet of peace or of recovery. It had turned into the measured stillness that precedes upheaval. Birds still called across the lake and wind still touched the water in ripples, but inside the Coleman house, both Richard and Eleanor moved as if preparing for a siege. They had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. The decision to go, public to hand over the digital evidence to an investigative journalist, had marked them as targets in a game they hadn't created but were now entrenched in. Richard, meticulous by nature and trained by years of navigating high-risk financial systems, spent the early hours triple securing the data. The flash drives had been cloned and distributed, one to Karen, one to a safety deposit box under an alias, and another hidden in a false compartment beneath the estate's old wine cellar. But even as he finished encrypting the final copy, a feeling gnawed at him. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding conflict, managing risk. Now he was housing a woman who had once been declared dead, and the truth she carried could collapse names and reputations not only within private industries, but inside the very institutions meant to protect citizens. Elena sat on the sunroom, floor knees pulled to her chest, a thick file of documents spread around her like a paper mosaic. She had begun organizing the content from Fordham and Crane into something more digestible, something the public could understand. The tech language had to be translated into plain terms. The digital crime had to be given human stakes. "This isn't just a case of stolen data," she said to Richard without looking up. "It's a case of stolen futures. Every time someone was profiled without their consent, every life decision nudged by manipulated algorithms, every democratic vote compromised by micro-targeted disinformation. It's a theft. It's violence in code." Richard looked at her. The clarity in her voice had changed. She no longer spoke as someone trying to remember who she was. She now spoke as someone who remembered all too well and wanted justice. That afternoon, they received an encrypted message from Tessa Holloway. Her voice, calm but intense, came through in a secure video call. "I've reviewed everything. I've verified 3 of the contract trails using independent sources. It's airtight. We're moving forward. The piece goes live in 72 hours, but I need your final approval." Elena didn't hesitate. "You have it." Holloway nodded. "There's something else. I traced one of the documents from the Fordham set. It was signed not just by Mason Doyle, but countersigned by a legal proxy operating under a shell company called Redridge Holdings. I dug into Redridge. It's a front. But here's the twist. One of its board members is running for the Senate." She dropped the name. Richard blinked. It was a man he had once shaken hands with during a fundraiser years ago, Daniel Mercer. A rising star in conservative politics, running on a platform of transparency and public accountability. "They've tied the data funnel to a political campaign?" Richard asked. "Not just tied," Tessa replied. "They were feeding Mercer with targeted data from the same algorithm Eleanor built. Voter profiles, swing metrics, soft vulnerabilities. He's been preaching privacy while using stolen data to game elections." A heavy silence followed. "We need to be careful," Elena said. "If he gets wind of this, we won't make it to 72 hours. That night, Richard did not sleep. He sat in the study with the lights off, watching security footage feed live to his monitor, checking every camera angle twice. Something felt off. The night was too quiet. The tension in his chest refused to fade. Just before 3 o'clock, in the morning, an alert flashed on his screen. Motion detected on the western perimeter. A dark shape moved past the hedges. Then another. 2 figures, dressed in black, moving in synchronized patterns toward the rear of the house. Richard bolted from the chair and rushed to Elena's room. "Wake up, we have to go now." She blinked, startled. "What?" "They're here." No time for explanation. They moved fast. Elena grabbed her bag, already prepped with essentials, and they made their way to the north wing, toward the old maintenance tunnel Richard had discovered years ago when restoring the estate. It had once been used by staff to move between the main house and the boathouse discreetly. Now, it would be their lifeline. As they entered the narrow, dim corridor beneath the house, Richard triggered the silent alarm, alerting Karen and Holloway through the backup satellite network. They emerged minutes later into the boathouse, the lake shimmering cold and still. Richard's second car, an older SUV stored there for emergencies, started without issue. As they pulled away from the property, neither of them looked back. Only, when they were miles away, did Richard finally speak. "We'll go to Karen's. She'll know how to hide us for now." Eleanor nodded, breath still ragged. "They know the article is coming. That's why they came now. They want to scare us into silence. They failed. At Karen's house, a secluded modern cabin near a state forest, they regrouped. Karen, always prepared for worst case scenarios, had a safe room built into her basement office. It was there they stored the final raw copy of the files. Elena updated the last version of her report, now titled The Red Pipeline. A chilling name, but accurate. While Richard and Karen coordinated logistics, Elena received a message on her secure phone. No number, just a line of text. "You should have stayed dead." She stared at it for a long moment, then turned the phone off and set it down. When she looked up at Richard, her voice was calm. "It's time to burn the whole thing down." They were no longer on the defensive. The offensive had begun. And nothing, not fear, not power, not the legacy of the men who once controlled her life, could stop what was coming next. By the second day in Karen's cabin, the forest surrounding the house had taken on the quality of both refuge and prison. The trees were dense, nearly impenetrable from a distance, and the cabin was fortified enough to offer a sense of temporary safety. But Richard knew the illusion wouldn't last. If someone had the resources to locate and breach his private estate, in Lakeview it was only a matter of time before they found this place too. The only question was whether they would be fast enough to strike before the story went live, and if so, whether they intended to silence Elena permanently or merely capture her and bury the truth more thoroughly than before. Karen had transformed her workspace into a command center. Several monitors were online at once, displaying maps, encrypted correspondence, real-time data tracking. The article was scheduled to publish within 24 hours, but they all knew that the real danger lay in the time before the launch. Elena sat at the desk with her laptop open, examining code fragments that had been pulled from the original data set. Each line she reviewed seemed to draw her deeper into a vortex of memory and consequence. "This wasn't just a system to funnel information," she said, barely above a whisper. There was a second layer, hidden encryption keys, access routes masked within outbound queries. Richard leaned over. "What does that mean?" "It means someone inside the network was using my architecture not just to collect information, but to build an alternative record, one no one else could see unless they knew how to look." This was espionage masquerading as analytics. Karen, who had been reading over a printed document in the corner, turned sharply. "And that second layer, was it controlled by Etherbridge or someone else?" Elena frowned. It was built within Etherbridge, but it answered to something beyond them. "I'm seeing tag protocols that map to government intelligence indexes, but the identifiers are scrubbed. These aren't domestic agencies, they're foreign." "Someone was selling the data outside the country," Richard said, the realization sinking in with a bitter weight. "Worse," Elena replied, "they were shaping narratives, sending disinformation back into our systems, using tailored metadata designed to trigger reaction algorithms. It wasn't just theft, it was contamination." Karen muttered something under her breath and stood, retrieving a thick manila envelope from her safe. "Then there's something you need to see." She laid the documents out across the table. Banking records, offshore transfers, property deeds. One name appeared again and again. Raymond Callister, a hedge fund manager with deep pockets and deeper connections, known in elite circles but invisible to the public eye. He wasn't on any board officially linked to Etherbridge, but his fingerprints were everywhere, through shell corporations, strategic donations, and lobbying efforts. "Callister is the invisible hand," Karen said. "He's funding Mercer's campaign. He's also listed as a guest at the same private conference Mason Doyle attended the year Eleanor disappeared." Elena stared at the name. "I've seen it on the firewall authorization logs. Callister was given master-level clearance through a shadow credential system. No one at my level should have known it existed." Richard sat back, connecting the dots. "So Mercer is the face, Doyle is the fixer, and Callister is the money." "There's more," Karen said, handing them another file. "One of Callister's subsidiaries recently purchased a property outside of Lakeview, a private compound." Elena's eyes narrowed. "They're closing in, setting up locally. It's not a coincidence." As the weight of this revelation settled over them, Richard stood and stepped outside to clear his head. The forest was thick with birdsong, but every sound felt amplified, like a warning. He took a long breath, staring at the tree line. His mind wandered back to Madeline, to the way she used to speak about integrity as though it were a living thing, something fragile and sacred. She would have never forgiven him for backing down now. He walked back into the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. "We release it all," he said, "not just the article, everything." Karen nodded. "Agreed. Redundancies are in place. If anything happens to us, the data dumps go public on secure platforms, encrypted and traceable to primary sources." Eleanor looked at him. "But that won't stop them from trying to stop us before it happens." "No," Richard said, "which means we need to expose someone who's still hidden." He pulled out his phone and made a call to a former colleague from his days in finance, an analyst who owed him more than one favor. The man answered quickly, and Richard asked one question. "Do you know who's been funding the risk analysis firm known as North March Strategies?" A pause, then a quiet reply. "It's a joint venture. 2 names on record. One is Raymond Callister, the other—" He stopped. "Who?" "Richard," demanded. "Arthur Caulfield." Richard froze. Arthur Caulfield had been his partner. They had built Coleman Caulfield Holdings together in the 90s. After Madeline's death, Richard had left everything, including Arthur. The man had always been ambitious, but not reckless, at least not to Richard's knowledge. He knew. "I left the company. He must have leveraged the silence," Richard murmured. Elena turned pale. "Then that's the connection. That's how they knew where to find me." "You're saying he's the leak?" "He's the one person close enough to you with the intelligence to anticipate how you'd act, and how to manipulate that information to their advantage." Karen sat down heavily. "Then someone you trusted sold your privacy, and by extension, Eleanor's safety." The betrayal was deeper than any of them had expected. Richard stood for a long moment, then walked to the desk and began writing. Not in code or legal form, but a statement, a confession, a testimony. One man's decision to admit he had once built systems that enabled power without accountability. And now he was using what was left of his voice to dismantle it. By nightfall, the statement was written, signed and added to the dossier. Elena read it in silence, then folded it into the final file. They were no longer chasing ghosts, they were facing them head-on. The final hours before the article's release stretched like taut wire. Inside the cabin, a hush had settled, not of peace but of anticipation. Every movement was precise, every breath controlled. Eleanor had stopped second-guessing her words. Her report was finished. The evidence was verified, redundancies ensured, and the network of journalistic partners set to echo the release once the first version went live. But Richard sensed it too clearly now. When a system feels threatened, it doesn't wait to defend itself. It strikes first. He had checked the perimeter sensors twice that evening. Everything appeared quiet, but his instincts, refined by decades of navigating the undercurrents of high-stakes business and the controlled silences of grief, told him this quiet was manufactured, controlled, too perfect. Karen had stepped away to make a secure call from her car, parked beneath the tree cover on the far side of the property. Eleanor was reviewing one last set of files near the fireplace when Richard's phone buzzed. Not a call, not a message, but a silent alert from the estate's old surveillance grid. It had gone offline. He turned sharply to Eleanor. "We need to move now." She looked up, eyes wide. No need for explanation. She grabbed her bag and followed Richard to the back of the cabin, where the ground-level escape hatch Karen had once built as a paranoid contingency now became their only route. The first sound came seconds later, glass shattering at the front of the house. Not a warning, not a bluff. Richard guided Elena through the narrow exit tunnel, its wood-paneled walls closing around them as dust fell from the ceiling with each tremor of movement above. Karen's voice crackled faintly in Richard's earpiece, distorted but urgent. "They're in the house, at least 4. I'm coming back now." "No," Richard snapped. "Get to the fallback point. We'll meet you there. Don't argue. Go." The tunnel led them to a shed positioned behind a copse of fir trees just over 200 feet from the cabin. Inside was a second vehicle, deliberately aged and dusty, but operational. They climbed in and started driving south, avoiding the main roads, taking back trails that twisted through the forest like veins. "Did they find the files?" Elena asked, breathless. "They didn't have time," Richard replied. "But they didn't need the files. They needed to stop us." As they drove, Richard's thoughts narrowed to cold precision. The attack wasn't random. It had come at exactly the right moment, between the final data verification and the scheduled transmission to Holloway's media partners. Someone had been watching their network, possibly someone close to the publication team, or a corrupted node within the encrypted relays. If the attackers couldn't steal the information, they would destroy the people. They reached a safe house 2 towns over, an old inn Richard had quietly purchased years ago under a trust name. The building was boarded on the outside, appearing abandoned, but inside it was functional. Karen joined them at dawn, carrying the physical hard drive hidden in a false compartment beneath her seat. She was bruised, cut above the eyebrow, her lips split, but alive. "They ran the place clean," she said. "Didn't even try to hide it. Military tactics, no badges, no warning. They were looking for her." Eleanor sat in the corner of the room, her hands shaking despite the stillness in her face. "They're trying to erase me again," she said. "But this time I'm not just one voice. We all know now, and we all have proof." Karen nodded, her face hard. "Then we don't just release the article, we go live." Richard turned. "You mean a broadcast?" "Exactly that. Holloway's team has been prepping for contingencies. If the written piece is compromised, we stream a live report. No edits, no cuts, just the truth straight to the public." Elena took a deep breath. "Then let's do it." The setup began within the hour. Holloway, once informed, activated her backup team. Coders, engineers, digital security experts working remotely from 3 separate locations. A live feed was prepared. Elena would speak, on camera, detailing her disappearance, the inner workings of Etherbridge, the illegal data pipelines, and the network of complicity that connected Doyle, Mercer, and Callister. Richard would corroborate, and Karen would validate the legal significance of the evidence presented. The final moment came at noon. A single red light on the camera blinked to life. Eleanor looked into the lens, her voice steady. "My name is Eleanor Blake. I was declared dead 3 years ago. What you're about to hear is the truth about why." She laid it all out. The manipulation of data to influence elections, the unauthorized profiling of citizens, the laundering of classified information to foreign entities. She named every name, showed every document. Her voice never trembled. Richard followed, explaining his role, his silence, and his decision to help bring the truth forward. Karen added legal context, outlining how the companies had violated both federal and international laws. The live feed ended 32 minutes later. They sat in silence waiting for the response, and it came not in minutes but in seconds. Thousands of comments, millions of views. Major news networks picked up the stream, rebroadcasting it. Hashtags emerged, trending globally. The names Doyle, Mercer, and Callister were no longer shadows, they were headlines. And then, just as the adrenaline began to fade, Eleanor's phone lit up again. An unknown number. A call this time. She answered. The voice on the other end was low, familiar, and broken by emotion. "Eleanor." She froze. "Who is this?" "It's me. It's Nathan." She didn't speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "You're alive," the voice whispered. "You're really alive." Richard leaned forward, watching her expression shift into something between disbelief and fear. "I thought you were dead," the voice continued. "They told me you were gone. I tried to find you, but where are you?" She interrupted. "Close," he said. "I need to see you." Richard mouthed the question, "Who is he?" Elena looked at him, then turned away slightly, shielding her voice. "My brother," she whispered. She ended the call with a trembling hand and stared at the floor, her entire body rigid. "He disappeared 2 years ago," she said. "No one ever found out where. I thought he was dead, too." Karen stood. "How did he get your number?" I don't know. But if he's been alive all this time, there's a chance he knows more than I do. A new door had opened, and behind it was the one person who might hold the last missing piece. The phone call from her brother altered the course of everything. For weeks, Eleanor had moved through a storm of fractured memories, system breaches, and the slow unearthing of a truth she had been buried under. She had confronted the men who erased her, exposed the system that tried to control her voice, and survived attacks meant to silence her. But nothing had prepared her for the sound of Nathan's voice, the one thing tethered to her life before. Everything fell apart. In that moment, she felt as though she had been dragged into a different dimension, one where memory and reality collided with devastating force. Richard watched her carefully as she paced the length of the small room, her phone still clenched in her hand, her fingers white from the pressure. She didn't speak for several minutes. When she finally did, her voice was flat. He said he's nearby, but he wouldn't say where. He wants to meet, alone. Karen, standing by the window, immediately shook her head. That's not safe. You know that. He's my brother, Eleanor replied almost defensively. He was also presumed dead for 2 years, Richard said, and he just now reappears after your live broadcast shakes the foundation of everything. You don't think that's more than coincidence? She turned to him, her expression torn. Nathan wasn't involved in this. He was always trying to protect me. Even when we were kids, he took the fall for things I did. I trust him. Karen's voice softened but didn't back down. Trust is earned, Eleanor. Right now we don't know where his loyalties lie. I know where mine lie, she said, and I can't move forward until I face him. They argued quietly for some time, debating logistics, security, contingencies. Eventually they reached a compromise. The meeting would happen in a public location, with Richard and Karen nearby watching from a distance. Eleanor would wear a concealed microphone. If anything went wrong, Richard would move in immediately. The meeting was set for the next afternoon, in a rundown botanical garden on the outskirts of the city, a place Nathan had chosen, one they used to visit as children. The symbolism wasn't lost on Eleanor. It was one of the last places she remembered seeing her brother before her life shattered. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and cloudy. Eleanor wore a grey coat, her hair pulled back, her expression composed but inwardly turbulent. Richard drove them to the location in silence, parking on the far side of the garden's entrance. Karen stayed in the back seat, eyes fixed on the surveillance feed synced with Eleanor's mic. She entered the garden alone, boots crunching against the gravel path. The place was nearly empty, the off-season keeping most visitors away. Glass. Panels reflected bare branches and grey skies. She walked past the old fountain, where she and Nathan had once made wishes. Then she saw him. He stood near the greenhouse entrance, hands deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched. His face was thinner, older, but unmistakably his. When their eyes met, he smiled, softly, uncertainly. Ellie, he said, using the name only he had called her. She stopped a few feet away. Nathan. He took a hesitant step forward. You're really alive. So are you, she said. Where have you been? He looked down. I tried to find you after you disappeared. I dug through everything, emails, surveillance footage, your work files. But then someone came after me. I had to run. I changed names, cities, everything. Who were they? Private agents, not police, not even feds. They were looking for the drive, the one you gave me before everything went dark. Eleanor blinked. What? Nathan nodded. You gave me a copy, said to hide it somewhere. Safe. You must not remember. But it was right before you vanished. We met at the train station. You handed me a flash drive and told me never to tell anyone. Eleanor stepped back, trying to process. I don't remember that. I didn't want to believe you were dead, so I kept looking. But when I saw your broadcast, I knew I had to find you. Do you still have the drive? He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, unmarked object. I kept it hidden, changed hands with it twice, but I never opened it. I didn't want to betray your trust. Karen's voice crackled faintly in Eleanor's earpiece. We need to get that drive. Eleanor nodded, then stepped forward. Come with me, we can keep you safe. But Nathan hesitated. There's more, Ellie. I think they've been watching me too. I think I led them to you." Before she could respond, Karen's voice screamed in the earpiece. "Get out now." Black van approaching from the north entrance. Richard was already running. Eleanor grabbed Nathan's arm. "We need to move, now." They sprinted through the garden paths, gravel slipping beneath their feet. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots shouted commands, the chaos of coordinated pursuit. Richard intercepted them near the side gate, dragging them toward the car. Karen was already inside, engine roaring. The van screeched to a stop just as they peeled away from the curb. "Drive!" Eleanor shouted. "They saw us!" But the van didn't pursue. It idled for a moment, then turned and drove off in the opposite direction. "Diversion," Karen said. "They wanted to rattle us, not capture us." Back at the safe house, Nathan sat with them in the dim light of the living room. He handed over the drive without ceremony. Eleanor plugged it in and opened the files. What she found stunned her. It wasn't a copy of the data from Etherbridge. It was a compiled ledger. Names, transaction histories, internal memos, cross-referenced with foreign lobbyists and covert campaign contributions. But these weren't from Etherbridge. They were from Redridge Holdings. The true power behind the operation. "This is the spine of the machine," she whispered. "This isn't just data laundering, it's state manipulation. These files, they show everything, not just what they did, but who paid them to do it." Karen leaned over the screen. "This could collapse campaigns, corporations, government branches." Richard stared at the file names. "This is the real target, not you, not Etherbridge, but the system that created both." Eleanor closed the laptop gently, her face pale but resolute. "And now we have the key to bring it down." They didn't know yet how deep the rot went, but for the first time they held something that couldn't be denied. Not by Mercer, not by Doyle, not even by Callister. The question now was whether they would live long enough to release it. The room where they gathered was heavy with the stillness of anticipation, a pressure that pulsed in silence, as if the walls themselves braced for impact. The drive Nathan had carried, hidden for years and delivered in a moment of desperation, now sat at the center of the table like a live device. Everyone in the room, Richard, Eleanor, Karen, and Nathan, understood that what it contained could change everything, but not without a cost. Eleanor spent the next several hours analyzing its contents with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Her hands moved without hesitation, eyes scanning lines of data that seemed to fill in the remaining gaps of her fragmented memory. The structure of the files was familiar, horrifyingly elegant. Each folder was a mirror to systems she had once helped build, ledgers masked as legal documentation, encrypted memos sent through diplomatic channels, internal emails coded in corporate jargon but undeniably explicit in their intentions. One folder stood out. It was labeled simply Risen. Inside were communications linking Raymond Callister directly to Mercer's campaign advisors, encrypted fund transfers connected to multiple shell accounts across 6 countries, and, most damning of all, a signed agreement authorizing the use of citizen data in behavioral prediction algorithms Eleanor herself had once designed for ethical research. "They took everything I built," she whispered, her voice low but furious, "everything that was meant to help people, and turned it into a tool for control, for profit, for political leverage." Richard leaned over, reading the names and dates alongside her. "This isn't just exposure. This is evidence of systemic treason." Karen nodded slowly. "And if we publish it without preparation, they'll erase it, and us, before it hits the second server." Nathan paced. "The room." "Then we don't publish. Not yet. We take it somewhere it can't be stopped." "Where?" Eleanor asked, turning to him. "Every major outlet is compromised or controlled. Mercer has people in every media network." "Not every network," Richard said, thinking aloud. "There's one that can't be bought because they've never tried to sell, Wells and Harrow. They're small, but they've broken stories before, the kind that government contractors tried to bury." Karen raised an eyebrow. "They're also constantly under legal fire. But yes, they're clean, or as clean as we're going to get." They agreed to set the meeting for the next morning. The lead investigative anchor at Wells and Harrow, Maya Leland, was already aware of Eleanor's case through the Holloway broadcast. She had offered support off the record in a message that had arrived encrypted and unsigned. Now it was time to cash in on that promise. But the night did not pass quietly. Just after 3 o'clock in the morning, the lights in the cabin flickered. Richard moved immediately to the window, scanning the woods. No visible movement. Karen pulled up the security feed. 3 of the exterior cameras had gone dark. Nathan grabbed the emergency bag and handed Eleanor her coat. "We move. Now." They left through the basement tunnel again, emerging into the nearby tree line under a moonless sky. This time there was no hesitation. They didn't look back. The SUV they had prepped for fallback was waiting in a covered clearing 2 miles out. They drove fast, not stopping until they reached the outskirts of Madison, where the Wells and Harrow team had secured a temporary broadcast facility under an abandoned theater complex. The meeting with Maya was brief, surgical. She didn't ask for small talk. The moment the drive was placed in her hands, she activated a multi-tiered protocol: upload redundancies, isolated verification servers, legal triage points, and live feed scheduling. "You realize," she said to Eleanor, "once this goes out, there's no going back. You'll be targeted not just by mercenaries or rogue assets, but by every system that has something to lose in this story." Eleanor didn't blink. "I'm already living on time that wasn't mine. I intend to use it." Maya nodded. "Then we air tonight. Prime time. No edits, no filters. You go on camera again, but this time we show the full scope." The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Richard offered a formal affidavit implicating Caulfield in knowledge of the system's financial scaffolding. Karen supplied legal precedents and statutes violated by Redridge Holdings. Nathan provided sworn testimony and the original drive chain. And Eleanor, she stood as the centerpiece, the one person who had lived through every layer of this corruption and emerged not just intact, but determined. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the red light went live. Eleanor sat before the camera again, a backdrop of blue-gray steel behind her, a simple banner at the bottom reading, "The Blake Files, Part 2, The Network." She spoke not like a survivor, but like an engineer, a witness, and a human being who had watched the machinery of power try to erase her. She walked through the creation of the data models, the original intent, the moment she realized her work had been hijacked. Then she exposed the connections: names, dates, financial transactions, predictive behavior models used to nudge voters toward outcomes that were not their own. The evidence was displayed on screen, in real time, line by line. Maya concluded the segment with an open challenge to the implicated institutions: deny these claims, and the source code, the financial trails, and the unredacted agreements will be released globally. It was a broadcast that couldn't be stopped, and it wasn't. By midnight, the repercussions had already begun. News anchors from traditional outlets were scrambling to explain their silence. Hashtags trended with unstoppable momentum. Protests erupted in several cities. Calls for Mercer to suspend his campaign flooded official channels. Anonymous leaks of corroborating documents poured in from former insiders, emboldened by Eleanor's courage. But not all responses were public. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Karen received a call from her security contact. "There's chatter," he said. "Encrypted channels. Someone put a price on Eleanor's head." Richard turned cold. "How much?" $750,000, alive, not dead. They want to know what else she hasn't said yet. Eleanor stood silently as the news landed. Then she walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. "They think if they capture me, they'll stop the story," she said, "but they don't understand." Richard approached. "Understand what?" "That the story isn't me anymore. It's out there now. They can take my voice, but they can't take what's already been heard." Karen stood and walked over. "We'll increase protection. I'll call Holloway. We'll move you again if needed." Eleanor shook her head. "No. No more hiding." Nathan stepped beside her. "Then we fight in the open together." Outside, the world was shifting, old structures beginning to crack. But inside that room, for the first time since her return, Eleanor felt not hunted, but anchored. not broken, but unafraid. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Blake sat in front of the world and told the truth. Not the diluted version presented by politics or the fragmented pieces managed by media spin, but the whole unvarnished truth, delivered with clarity and purpose. In that half-year, entire institutions had begun to shift, not because of one story or one face, but because the illusion of invulnerability had finally been broken. Eleanor hadn't just survived her erasure, she had reversed it, exposed the machine behind it, and in doing so forced it to reckon with its own reflection. It was late afternoon in Lakeview when Richard sat once again by the edge of Silverstone Lake. The seasons had changed, replacing frost-bitten silence with the soft stirrings of spring. The water mirrored the sky, flat and endless. He was alone, though the loneliness no longer felt like absence. In his hand was a paperback edition of a published investigation, a compilation of transcripts, reports, and contextual essays titled The Red Pipeline. Eleanor's testimony had become a keystone document in modern whistleblower history. Universities taught it, legislators referenced it, activists memorized it. The repercussions had been as far-reaching as they were swift. Mercer's campaign collapsed under scrutiny, his backers retreating into silence, some seeking immunity deals, others vanishing entirely from the public stage. Mason Doyle, exposed as the architect of multiple clandestine operations, was indicted on several counts, ranging from conspiracy to federal data theft. Raymond Callister had not been arrested yet, but his empire was hemorrhaging. Investigations were ongoing across 3 continents, and Arthur Caulfield, Richard's former partner, the man who had stood beside him in boardrooms and funeral parlors alike, was facing a congressional subpoena. The betrayal had stung deeper than Richard ever admitted aloud, but in time, even that wound had begun to scab over, not with resignation but with understanding. Some men choose power over people, others, when given the choice, walk away. Richard had walked away once. He hadn't made the same mistake again. A soft crunch of gravel signaled someone approaching. He turned his head slightly and saw her. Eleanor stood at the edge of the path, her silhouette calm, eyes thoughtful. She looked stronger now, not just physically, though the weight she'd regained and the steadiness of her posture spoke of resilience, but in the quiet depth of her presence. She was no longer hunted. She was no longer unknown. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Richard gestured to the bench beside him. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, looking out at the lake. "It's strange," she said after a pause. "Coming back here, this is where everything restarted." "It's where you were found," Richard replied. "That's different from being lost." She smiled faintly. "Still feels like another lifetime." In many ways it was. They sat in silence for a long time. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting the lake in amber light. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp soil. No helicopters overhead. No coded messages buzzing on encrypted phones, just quiet and presence. "I've decided not to change my name again," she said eventually. "The protection detail offered it. Said I'd be safer if I disappeared into something anonymous. But I've spent too long being nobody." "You've earned your name back," Richard said. "I'm starting to realize it was never really gone, just buried under lies. But the more I speak it, the more it feels like mine again." He nodded. "What now?" "I've been offered a position at the Center for Digital Ethics. They want me to lead a task force on data accountability, real reform, not just press releases." "You'll take it?" She hesitated. "I think so, but I also want to keep writing. There's more to tell, not just my story. Others, like me, stories that didn't get the microphone in time." Richard looked down at the book in his hand. "You're good at it." "I had help," she said softly, glancing at him, "from someone who didn't have to care, who could have walked away again but didn't." "I'd already spent enough time watching the world through glass," he replied. It was time to break a few windows. They laughed quietly. The shared weight of everything they had endured no longer felt crushing. It simply existed as part of the past, not undone, not forgotten, but carried differently now. Elena reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. She handed it to him. It was the image from the town fair, the one Richard had first found on that forgotten forum, the blurry, sunlit picture that had sparked recognition. But this copy was crisp, restored. It now sat in the official archives of the investigation, labeled as the last known image of Eleanor Blake before her disappearance. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Not the end, just the middle." "Thought you should have a copy," she said. Richard took it, holding it carefully. "Thank you." They sat a while longer. At some point, the sun slipped fully behind the hills, and the first stars blinked into existence above the dark water. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I think that's all right." They stood together, the lake behind them, the long road ahead unseen but finally, unmistakably theirs. And as they walked back toward the house, toward whatever came after truth, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of meaning, and of lives reclaimed. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what's worth rebuilding. And sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply to remain visible, unbroken, unbought, and unmistakably alive. As the wind moved through the trees and the water whispered against the shore, one thing was certain. Eleanor Blake had not been erased. She had been rewritten, and this time the final page belonged to her.